Hello, everyone. Welcome to our peer-to-peer session, How Creatives Can Be Seen and Found in a Data-Driven World with Laurie Zapalac. My name is Hendrik Hernandez Resto. I am the creative specialist for New Bedford Creative at the New Bedford Economic Development Council. Thank you for joining us today. Before I go any further, please enter your first and last name in the chat along with your email for our records. Thank you. This peer-to-peer series is geared to enrich, educate, and connect creatives within our community. New Bedford is the home of artists, creatives, change makers, designers, entrepreneurs, and community enthusiasts, and the peer-to-peer sessions embrace the pulse that make New Bedford so unique while also expanding our knowledge and connections. New Bedford Creative offers many opportunities for artists and cultural organizations. Join our creative directory, apply for one of our grants, or call for arts. List your event on our calendar, all for free, at our website, newbedfordcreative.org. Peer-to-peer sessions is supported in part by the City of New Bedford through the American Rescue Plan Award and Arts and Culture and Tourism Fund, facilitated by New Bedford Creative at the New Bedford Economic Development Council. We would like to thank Mayor John Mitchell, his administration, and the entire New Bedford City Council for their continued support of the creative sector. This is just one component of a broader initiative to boost arts-based economic development and help the creative sector recover from the pandemic. Before I introduce our presenter, I want to go over the format for this session. Once I'm done, I'll pass it over to Laurie. Once Laurie is finished, we will open up for Q&A. I will review the questions in the chat first, then we can continue with the Q&A live. We will have about 20 minutes for questions, so we can wrap this up by 2 p.m. Just so everyone is aware, the session will be recorded. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat so we don't miss them when we open up for Q&A. Most sessions throughout the series have been recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel at New Bedford Creative in the following week. All right, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Laurie Zapalac, who will teach you all about how to stand out in a data-driven world. Now, I will pass it over to Laurie to share more details of who she is and what she will present today. Go for it, Laurie. I'm going to be muting myself now.
Great. Thank you so much, Hendrik, and thanks to everybody for being on the call today. I really see this as a conversation. So I have some questions for you all about what your hopes are, what your fears are around this topic. And in some cases, Hendrik and I were chatting before this last week, and we were talking about the fact that, oftentimes when you're submitting information that has a code or that is tax related, finance related, it can cause some anxiety to come up. I know when I do my taxes, it does some of that. But what I really hope is that you all will come away with this with a little bit more insight about what purposes industry classification codes serve, and when it affects you as an independent creative, as an organization, as a business, just some of the kind of, I'm going to call it like the economic history, the context, and then kind of when you need to worry about it and when you don't. And we'll have a talk about that, because I'm actually curious to know if you've filled out an application for a grant and you've seen reference to a NAICS code or an occupation code. So we'll get into some of the technical aspects of what those are. But then the other thing I want us to keep in mind is this idea of the codes serve the purpose of such that you identify like the activity of what you are doing, and can be seen, you know, of course, for tax purposes by the state, for tracking of what our economy is, what businesses exist, that affects policy down the road. But then also there's just this big kind of challenge right now that we live in this like world with so much data and so many internet everythings. And you are a bit of like, you are a needle in a haystack in that context. And so we want to talk about, you know, just some simple practices for finding what's probably your right code. And then the trick that I'll say is that we want to have that be reflected in the other ways you describe yourself. So that's any type of written description that you have on Instagram, your website, other socials. We just want to do, it's like a little bit of house cleaning to be sure that what is written, that there's some matching going on. So we'll look at that with some specificity as we move through this. But I also will put this in context of the work that we've done recently with the report on the composition of New Bedford's creative economy, because it's really that work that's, excuse me, that's allowed us to probe into, you know, why should we be having a conversation about industry classification codes? So I'm going to jump in. Can everybody see the slide? Yeah, okay. So, and for this, I actually borrowed our graphic, which I'll talk about, which comes from that report. And I do want to mention, I encourage, if you haven't had a chance to read that report or to look at it, there's a lot more on this topic in that report. And I talked about when we presented this last week in the press conference that visualizing the data, each of these circles represents either an independent creative, creative business with employees, or a nonprofit organization, or a public institution that falls within the activity of the creative economy. And so we, not only doing this visually, but also using photographs, we feel that that's really important because it allows us to literally look at who's participating, and then of course to understand their needs too, you know, and for us to all be, I'm going to use the royal we in this context, for us to be in community, to work as a community of practice, in thinking about the cumulative impact of creatives in the New Bedford economy. And I'd say really it's both the economic and the social impact. So we're going to talk about the background on these codes, what they are, what they were built for, when they work well and when they don't. We're going to talk a little bit about this idea of matching. And then I have some resources to leave you with. And these are both going to be specific to the idea of if you need to do some research on your industry classification codes, but also they more broadly business resources that are available to you, business planning resources, and they can be used whether you're an independent creative, a business, and in some cases also as a nonprofit, and freely available. So I'm going to emphasize free, make use of them, and then any questions we might have. So just as a quick background, so the idea of classifying what's taking place in our economy, that really started in the 30s. And it started with a system called the Standard Industrial Classification System, or SIC. So you'll see reference still today to SIC codes. And that was really back when the US economy was about manufacturing, was making things. As our economy began to change and computers began to have a significant impact, we saw the rise of the information economy, service economy, high tech. It was realized that whole system was really kind of out of date. So in 1997, US, Mexico, and Canada came together and they came up with a new system. And it was more, let's call it production oriented. But again, it was the same purpose was to classify what we call establishments. So not individual occupations, but companies, organizations, or in this case, if you are an independent creative, we treat you like an establishment. So it's a 6-digit hierarchical code. I'll show you what that means. And it allows us to get pretty nuanced. Every 5 years it's updated, which is also part of the challenge because, or it creates challenges because when we try to compare, let's say, the economy of 1990 to 2020 even, we have to like match the codes and it's really tedious. But still, it is one of the tools that we can use to say what's happening. So if you look at the census today, what you would find is that particularly in what's called the American Community Survey, which provides some of our information about our economy, including employment across industries, there's this methodology of using the 2-digit, that's the first 2 numbers, and categorizing, and you'll see that there are these on this just left side, these sets of first 2 numbers, and they have these broad kind of industry categories. And depending upon where you are in the country, you might see a whole bunch in like the groups that start with 11 and 21. Like in Maine, you'll see much more around forestry, for instance. Today, we have a lot of the US economy that's actually hovering in the categories that start with 52 and 53, kind of the service-based economy. And then you see if you get down to 71, and in this case, the census likes to bundle these to include 71, 72, but 71 is art, entertainment, and recreation. And really, that's where a lot of our creatives are found. But the interesting thing to me is when we talk about a creative economy, we don't just talk about artists. We also talk about graphic designers, architects, a whole range of activities. And so in reality, if we want a picture of the creative economy, we pull 6-digit NAICS codes from across these groups. And so it's like we assemble a specific view to understand looking across, so in some cases across retail, across professional services, across arts, entertainment, recreation, to build this customized view. And we've also found that everybody kind of does this differently. And as our economy continues to evolve, we have to adjust the lens. So for instance, there really wasn't a code for social media influencer in the year 2000, and there kind of is now. And we'll continue to see things as new occupations emerge that this code approach will need to respond to. So, and just to give you an example, because I know we do have a lot of independent creatives in New Bedford, the big group would be group 71, and then in this case, what's called the 4-digit code, this is like the I'm trying to think, like genus philo, the subgroup is that 7115, but then the 6-digit code, which is the level that you would probably be asked to provide of like, what's your NAICS code if you're applying for a loan or a business application, is generally at that 6-digit level. And so that 711510 is a very common code. It would be the appropriate code for independent creatives. But I did also want to note, I find this really interesting that category, the text that's italicized here at the bottom, points out that industry also includes athletes and other celebrities exclusively engaged in endorsing products and making speeches or public appearances for which they receive a fee. So in the case of when like Tom Brady is being paid for being a performer, that's his code. I find that kind of interesting that and that's a growing field too. I'm getting into the weeds, but I thought that was a relevant example. So this is the broad matter in which we're trying to kind of say, hey, how can we identify creative establishments? Then the other thing I want to touch on just very briefly is that The other type of code that you'll often see, and this is relevant to establishments that have employees, so that could be a business with employees, it could be nonprofit with employees, is that there's also what's called the Standard Occupational Classification Code. And that's another code for identifying the actual occupations of the individuals within an organization. And this comes about specifically in tax reporting for any entity that has employees, where you're going to say what the employee is and what their individual code is, whether they're a graphic designer, a teacher, your treasurer. And so that's another code type. Today, we're going to focus primarily talking about NAICS, but I'm happy to answer or to try to address any questions about SOC as well. Let me see here. And then I did want to mention this briefly. So how are these codes used? This is an example where the Bureau, this pertains to SOC codes. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does collect this information including to look at like what's our employment across these categories, what's the annual mean wages, and that of course is useful both for policy and then others. There's a lot of other people that also use this data. So if you go to glassdoor.com or monster.com, you might be able to look up like what does an architect make on average, or what does an architect make in a particular state. So this information, I point that out to say this information can also be useful to you as a consumer, particularly if you are on the job market. So does that track with everybody? Okay, all right, we'll move along. Let me see. Okay, so our report that was just completed, sought to look across the data that we have available to understand what's taking place in New Bedford, and we used a methodology that the New England Foundation for the Arts had developed, in which they built these 17 code groups to get at different elements of the creative economy. And I use this because now we start to get into the brass tacks and to codes that might apply to you. So within each of these code groups, and then in addition to the 17, we New Bedford added 3 New Bedford specific code groups. And I'll show you a couple of examples of these. But for each of the code groups, so just as an example, group 1, architecture and design, in the data we've collected, again, building off of NEFA, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 codes. And in this case, you'll see that they all fall under that 54 code, 2-digit code group. So this is not as heterogeneous as some of the others that are assembled to make up that picture of media, for instance. But here you see, so depending upon, let's say you are a designer, you're an architect, that's a pretty easy one. You're going to be in 541310. One of the areas that we found a lot of that I'm not like super happy with where the code methodology sits now, but if you're a fashion designer, you fall into 541490, other specialized design services. So that's kind of a catch-all, if you will. There's no one explicit code for fashion designer. So I'm going to talk about how to find that too. If you are a fashion designer, how do you actually get to that number? But just pointing out, this NAICS is far from perfect. And then we have to use it. We have to sometimes be a little, kind of come at it from different ways to get the information to confirm, what in fact we are. So as an example, just a couple of these. So within group 1, some of the entities that we found, and then we visualized how big or how small they are based upon number of jobs, number of employees. And I will also point out in this visualization, the small circles, which tend to be the independent creatives, The labels are not here because this is a still, this is a screenshot. But in the future, that's one thing that I hope that as this data is living data, that you can literally on the New Bedford Creative website be able to click and see who that is. So as we go forward, group 13, this is the one that has the NAICS code for independent creatives. And so we see all those independent creatives in the little individual circles. And then some of the entities that have a greater number of employees represented as well. And then just the last example, group 20, the hair and body art group, also a lot of independent creatives here. And so, you know, huge economic impact when we put all of this together, which is really fascinating to see. And then I think, as we talked about, this was the visualization that we did to show all of the, you know, the whole collective of what we found. So, and here's kind of, I think, where we are right now with this work that's been done is 20 code groups is really useful from a standpoint of looking at economic analysis, but it's too many code groups for everybody to keep track of. It's just too much to hold in your head per se. And so with the kind of the realization that it's like, we do want to track this in New Bedford. We want to keep tracking it. And so what we did is we consolidated from that 20 to cluster or chunk them into these 8 big groups. And so the idea is that in continuing to manage and have the New Bedford Creative Directory be a living, breathing resource, and in encouraging each of you all to submit your profile to CreativeGround, New Bedford's regional resource, hopefully this gives you like a roadmap of where, you know, that you can find yourself in one of these 8 groups. And so let me also pause there and say, if you feel like you're doing something that doesn't fall into one of these 8 groups, we also need to know that. So why, I'm going to throw the question back to you. Why would we need to know that? Anybody have a thought? So if you're doing something creative and it doesn't fall within one of these 8 groups, you're probably being a pioneer. You're probably out on the forefront. You're probably innovating. And so it would be good for us to see kind of where we might be having like new blooming within the creative economy. And it's also possible that we've just like missed something. So if you don't feel like you fit in one of these, please do let us know. Please do let us know any feedback, because again, this will not stay static over time. It will continue to evolve as our activity evolves. Okay, so so my goal is I want to help you be sure you can find your NAICS code. And not only so that I can see you in the data, and then I can help you communicate your impact to City Council, the mayor, our Massachusetts legislators, our elected delegation at the federal level, so that we continue to invest in arts, culture, and creativity. That's one key goal of why we want to go to the trouble to be sure anytime you have anything that requires a code, you know what to fill in. But also from the standpoint of sometimes it does matter. And so let me just ask, and I kind of know this broadly, but how let me see how can we do this? How many people on the call are an independent creative? If you just maybe raise your hand, I see a couple hands, 2 hands at least. How many people represent a nonprofit? Let me see if I can see everybody. Whoops. Okay. Margot. Hi, Margot. Good. Does anybody represent creative business who has employees? Okay, so so nobody, or did I get one?
So yes, stage artistry does.
Great.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Whoops, and now I've got a little bit of feedback. Let's see if we can. Okay, if not, we'll keep going. Great. Okay, so the let me see. Are you all hearing the feedback?
Yes, everyone needs to stay on mute while Laurie's talking, please.
Sorry about that. Thanks, guys. So it's interesting from the standpoint that as an independent creative, you do not necessarily need to register. There's no fees that you pay as an independent creative, but you do need to register either your business name or a doing business as. And that is actually important because that's also where in the doing of that some of that data that is collected is where the business subscription data sets are pulling information from. So I mentioned that I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do that, but some of the resources that I provide at the end can help you walk through that if you haven't done it yet. And then just briefly, if you do choose to register as a sole prop, or if you probably already know, or Den can help you also pursue some of the decision making in this, that you can file your just one tax return, so you don't have to file separate taxes for your business. There's some good information about some of the decision tree sites like zenbusiness.com. Actually, I think they explain it very clearly. And I mentioned, because we're on this topic, in the event that you do go down that road and you choose to be a sole proprietor, it makes the accounting more flexible or more simple, but you can be held personally liable. You can be sued, and creditors can pursue personal assets. So it's one reason why you might want to consider registering as a single entity LLC. In which case you're it's kind of like a both and. You're a sole proprietor. You can just be a single owner, but you have the protection of an LLC. So there's some legal protection. They can only go after your business assets. And I'd say, from the standpoint of for many independent artists, this isn't going to be as much of a worry as it would be in other fields. But there's a little bit more cost associated with that. It's $500 annually plus $20 as a fee, but it gives you that legal protection. And then just to remind you that if you do have to collect business taxes, you register with Mass Tax Connect. I've misspelled that. And there's more information there. So if you're selling goods, your tax structure may be different than if you're selling services, for instance. And then again, depending upon what you are doing, you may need to pursue other business licenses. And that's another area where this code, knowing your code or your codes may be important. Pursuing a loan, loans in particular are where you may see this come up. And the interesting thing is, a bank isn't necessarily going to pick you apart for what you choose, but it may result in you being put in like one track or one pile, if you will, or another. And so again, to have the most accurate information you can is important. Eligibility for business grants, eligibility for business technical assistance, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then our business directories, like even New Bedford Creative Now, this idea that we do want to start to collect these codes, and then it's going to help us report back what activity we're seeing within New Bedford. So the easiest resource to use to figure out what's my code is to go to census.com/NAICS, and you'll see in here that there is a search bar for the 2022 NAICS search. You can also search the 2017 and the 2012. Now, why do we have 3? The fact of the matter is that even though the 2022 version exists, some reporting is still using the 2017. So depending upon what you're filling out for, you might see a reference to please provide the 2017 NAICS code. And then just as an example, I put in fashion designer. And again, you see here that you get that 6-digit code, which says fashion designer services. Technically, that code says other design services in its catch-all. So this is the easiest, kind of the primary source for finding your NAICS code. And then you can also go to NAICS.com. And what I think is interesting about this is that, and even though I wrote fashion designer, really it's looking for a fashion design establishment. So let me clarify that. That's really a typo on my part, but a fashion design company. Because again, the NAICS is about establishments rather than the individual occupation. And so what I also thought was interesting is that what NAICS.com does is it shows you not just the code that comes up. And again, here we see that primary code of other specialized design services, common keywords, fashion designer, but it also shows you other similar codes. So if you are doing something that you think might fall like at the edge or between the cracks, you can use this, and you can actually click on these, and then you'll see descriptions of companies or entity establishments that actually have that code. So you would see, oh, am I similar to a Donna Karen or a similar company? And they're gonna tend to show you examples of large companies, but it is still helpful to be like, okay, is that comparable to what I'm doing, where they're also that type of designer? And yeah, so that I think is pretty interesting. And you'll start to see here as an example of the code for the independent artist, writer, and performer. This is a good example, like the scenery designer, independent theatrical design, that kind of tells you it falls within that 711510. So this is a useful resource. And if you ever run into a question, my message here is really, this is when you go to your peers. This is also, I think, another benefit of the work done in the Creative Economy report is hopefully you can see that there's a lot of people or people who are doing similar things to you that you can go to and talk to about this. And then in the context of, you found your code or you think you have your code, trying to allay fears of, have you registered your business correctly? Do you have your, or maybe you're trying to decide. I want to make a plug for 2 programs that are free at the moment that are available to each of you as small businesses, or each of you who represent a small business. And I also want to say that if you are a nonprofit and you have business related questions, you can also apply to this program. It's called Small Business Strong, and it was created during the pandemic, and through some grant support money, it's been extended and has moved into servicing the South Coast. And as a member of the South Coast region, you can seek up to 15 hours of advisory service for free. So it's a really great program. I encourage each of you to apply. If you have any questions, whether it's about your code, it's about your business structure, it's about your profit and loss, it's what is a profit and loss, it's anything. And it's a really great thing. So while it exists, I highly recommend it. And then the second is SCORE, which you may know about, which is a great, very similar and actually a long-standing program, but in particular, you can be paired with a mentor. And then they also have a lot of webinars available and workshops, both online and in person. So if you haven't already taken a look at SCORE, I would recommend that as well. And then finally, related to lending. So particularly if you have a lending question and you're trying to, or you have a lending form, certainly you have commercial lenders in New Bedford, but also don't forget about the NBEDC as a lending category. And that's one thing that we found during the reporting on the creative economy is that you have establishments that the NBEDC has been servicing an increasing number of creative enterprises, and it would be great for that to continue. And then finally, and this is where it comes to discussion about your verbiage and your profile and matching your code. I think it was in 2021 that Kate Anderson, who used to be with Boston Art, actually did a peer-to-peer session. And some of you might have been on it, but it was about using Instagram as a creative, and kind of Kate, as an art consultant, was talking about how the process that she uses to find artists for commissions. And since that time, she has gone on to start a company called Alchemy Station. And they have in their plan to do more of the educating that I'd say is going to parallel what I've talked about knowing your code, where she is going to really talk about how to describe yourself such that you can be found in from someone searching for commission. And so that is where I think the best place to start on this is if you're updating your profile, as you're thinking about what is it that I do, what industry code do I fall into, you're a fashion designer, be certain you are saying, I am a fashion designer, and it can still be in your broad context, but on your Instagram, on your website, on whatever social media you're using, like in some ways you want to have the language of your industry classification code embedded into that text. And so why is that important? It's increasingly important because as AI helps us to identify and kind of cut across and are searching large swaths of data, if someone Googles fashion designer New Bedford, we want to be sure you come up. And then we want to be sure that that can be, I'm going to call it triangulated or connected to some of this other data that we can identify about jobs and revenue as well from a research perspective. So I think the best way to do that is to work with each other, work with other people, and pretend like ask them to try to search for you and see if they find you, and then go from there in terms of the editing. And it's really interesting. I'm gonna stop at this point, and I'm happy to pull individual slides back up. But as we were vetting some of the data in the creative economy research, sometimes it was a little hard to figure out exactly what it was someone was doing. And sometimes that's okay. For instance, like Nellie's Bodega, is it a bodega or is it a fashion designer? But you do need pretty soon, if you've got a cryptic name, to tell people what it is that you do in particular. Let me stop there and see what questions we have.
Yes, we'll start with the questions in the chat, because at this time, that's what we do. We open it up to the questions. I'll start with the questions in the chat first, and then if there are more questions to add, we'll address them then Please feel free to unmute yourself when we are finished with the questions in the chat. We would love to discuss this with you and for it to be an open conversation. So I did see one in particular from Paula Robinson Deere. And the question was, what about those who move between codes, e.g. publishing, cooking, or teaching?
Great question. Yeah, that's spot on. And because we see these like multiple hat wearers of that creatives often are. So you often can put more than one code. And if you are given that option, I would. So you can think of it as and yeah, what is the are you a culinary designer? Let me just find your question here real quick to reference your language. Are you a publishing company? Are you publishing on cooking? If you're publishing on cooking, you're publishing. Yeah. But yeah, that's a perfect example. And then we did find many creatives offer some type of workshop. And so then that does put you into the educator category as well. So I do think it's about thinking like, what's your primary and what's your secondary? But again, I would try to have, if you can pick more than one code, do that. And then be sure you're also establishing that we do this, in writing, it's about this. We also offer these workshops. Yeah. To spell it out very clearly to people. Is that thorough enough? Okay, thanks, Paula. Great.
I didn't see any other questions that were too direct here. So if anybody else wants to jump in now and ask verbally, if you have any questions, please feel free to do so. Unmute yourself and then ask.
I just want to say thank you, Laurie, for giving this presentation. I'm sorry for coming in a little late, but I love being able to look at different data points to help make decisions moving forward. My question is, what are your thoughts on creatives using bits of like codes as they're learning about how to file for their taxes or learning how to look at other databases to make decisions on how they're going to implement themselves into the economy? I know that's like a very general question, but I think it's really important because those kinds of thoughts are not really common in the creative mindset. Again, like someone who went to school for art, this was never discussed, but then you try to implement into the economy afterwards, and it's really important to kind of see how you fit into that language. Could you go on a little bit about that? I know it's kind of nebulous.
Yeah, sure. No, I think I agree with you. Thinking of like, what is the business frame through which we see this activity isn't always top of mind, or I hope that's changing, but let's use New Bedford food tours as an example. We were discussing, are they a promoter, which has its own category, or are they a content producer and an experience producer? And so, you might, if you're doing something really novel, you might not fit really wholly but the good news is we want you to pick a code that's close, and rather than putting something so general or no code at all. That's how I'd say, like, good is better than nothing. Or don't just end up in the code for automotive services, which unfortunately we saw a lot of that. Oh, that must be a really easy code to write in. And certainly, yes, do look at your peers, because that they might be able to help you crack the nut and like, oh, we actually really think, Kat, that you fit in here. And like for someone who is an illustrator, yeah, versus a designer, yeah, there are some differences there. Another big thing is going to be if you are seeing yourself as staying as an independent creative, or if you do envision having employees, in terms of, that's going to be a big decision in terms of what code that you end up in, particularly for some of the retail activities in New Bedford. Yeah, did that
Yes.
get it?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
can I really quickly, I see one point that Den said, where he said, if you don't, in the comments, if you don't have a DAB at doing business as, or DBA or LLC, banks won't treat you as a business at all. Thank you for bringing that up. As a sole prop, you don't necessarily have to pursue a DBA or getting what's called an EIN, an employer identification number, rather, but you can get it. And it's really useful, to Den's point, for any type, for getting a bank account. Like it's pretty much going to be required. Den, does that track with what you've seen?
Yeah, if you want a bank account that has any reference to your business, you want to be able to cut checks, pay people from your business, accept payments to your business. The bank is not going to deal with you. You can use your social security number. You don't need a separate EIN, but you're going to need to go to your town or your city and file a piece of paperwork to become a DBA. Which then you can take to the bank, or you can file for an LLC and then you can take that to the bank. But the bank will only treat you as an individual unless you have one of those pieces of paper. And most people, if you're, even if you're an artist, just if you're painting or a photographer or whatever, you want to have an account somewhere that has your business name on it, so that you can treat people and deal with people that way. It's also good for your accounting purposes and your tax purposes. And I put a reference in the chat to one of the workshops we did that deals with that directly.
Yeah, I can't underscore that enough. I think many of us have lived and learned that it's really helpful to start off and have a separate business account, be able to have a profit and loss statement that isn't entwined with your personal spending.
You can have more than one as well. I have one for my consulting business. I have one for my art brokerage. I have one for my photography. I have one for our management. For our website services. So you can have multiple ones. And have multiple bank accounts under each of those, and you can roll them up at tax time if you want to. But you should treat the books for each of them separately, so you know if they're profitable or not.
Yeah, thank you. I see a question also from Mary about, or sorry, Hendrik, did we miss any? Or I can take that one, and if I did. So it's a Stage Artistry Studios. It's a performing arts school, but it is not a dance school and not a music school, but those are the descriptions that come up often. I believe that is all still under one 6-digit code. I will look after that because I'm curious to see if I can see any other potential.
Okay, yeah, every time we try to categorize ourselves, there never seems to be anywhere where we fit. So
Yeah.
I know you had said you had wanted to kind of know if that was the case, and it definitely is for us. Even on search engines, it's really hard for us to get found because of what we do is very specific.
Yeah,
so we're not a theater, but we're a theater school. We're not a dance school. It's all it's just different. So
yeah, and that's a great example where the codes just, sometimes it may be like, okay, this is good enough, but that does also say to me, you've got to go above and beyond and spelling out what you are if it's not something that's a known entity. And I think this is also a case of it's asking, well, when does it matter? Does it matter for you in particular? That broader code may be sufficient from a standpoint of like identifying grant opportunities, because sometimes grant
right.
you use NAICS codes, but you will, as it sounds like you're doing, have to say we are specifically this, if it's not really evident.
Okay.
But I'd say also don't worry, like no one's going to penalize you for being special.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions in the chat we see? Okay. So I think maybe the follow-up question I have for you guys is well, let me be sure. Is it clear that what we're trying to do is like get the best dialed in lens that we can on the activity, both for the sake of knowing what's in New Bedford, but then for helping you be seen, helping you be found when search is come up or when you're pursuing a grant or a loan, that people understand kind of as much as they can what it is that you do. But then I think the other question is like, what are the other stressors, if not on this very specific point? What are the other things that are like cause the anxiety? And is it more on like, I'm scared if I get this wrong, my taxes, the tax man's going to come after me, or I just need help in figuring out if I should be a sole prop or a something else? Because I think that's also going to help us identify kind of where to go next in terms of conversations about technical assistance.
Laurie, can you pull up in your slide deck where you described the NAICS code, 2-digit, 4-digit, 6-digit? I think many people are going to fall under that category. Keith, I think that's Keith. Is that Keith Francis? Who does public commissions and sells fine art in New York City galleries. So he's asking what code he should use.
Yes. So chances are, sounds like Keith, you might actually have two different types of activity, which is if you are you're an independent artist who takes commissions, is that right? Yes, okay. And great, and hello, your students. And you sell fine art in NYC galleries. Yes, so that sounds like, unless you own the gallery, in which case we would be talking about a different code set. It sounds like you fall into the purview of gosh, I can almost remember the code. Let me pull it up. Of the 711510. Let me just share the screen real quick. And I'd say just as a point, that was, of all the codes that we saw in New Bedford, that one had the largest single number of entities. And so it's in that broad, the 2-digit is the 71, the art, entertainment, and recreation. And then the 6-digit would be the independent artists, writers, and performers. So it sounds like you fit there. Yeah, sometimes those those that own a gallery, where the gallery evolves into not just selling your own art, but other work, that's when you're gonna also be in the retail trade category, most likely as well. And so it's a bit of a question of, and if you are managing a gallery that also sells other work, my guess is you probably want to be working with an accountant at that point to be sure that you've got a good system in place for managing all that. Great. And Margot, thank you for, if everybody saw in the chat, there's the direct link to business license registration for the City of New Bedford as well. So to have so that you are on record. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Laurie. If nothing else, I'll do the closing for you.
Yeah. And sorry, I just want to mention one other thing. In the appendix of the report is a table that has every single code in the 20 code group. So you can also, I somehow forgot to say that. You can start there, and chances are you're going to see your code. And if you don't, let us know.
Where's that report located again, Laurie?
Yeah, Marco, is it up on New Bedford Creative yet?
Yeah, it is. I'll reshare the link.
Thank you, Margaret.
Yay! Awesome.
Excellent. So I want to thank you for your time this afternoon. This was a great session. I'd like to also thank Laurie once again for their hard work. Also, I would like to thank our funder, the City of New Bedford, for making this possible. Please be sure to visit our website where you will find that report, newbedfordcreative.org, so newbedfordcreative.org, and join our free creative directory. This is the list that we use to promote on our social media throughout the year. Make sure to add your events, gallery exhibitions, or more to our calendar page that is linked to South Coast Today. We want our creatives to excel, and we are here to help.
Great.
We have plenty of peer-to-peer sessions coming up. Please join us for our next session, Creative a Cohesive Brand with Jaden Reyes of Brown Sugar Stationery on Tuesday, May 21st, 2024 at 1 p.m. The link is now inserted into the chat. I just put it there. Lastly, the recording of today's session will be on our YouTube channel within the next week. So search for us on YouTube at New Bedford Creative, and have a great day, and thank you for your participation.